welcome once again to Shine Today, and what a guest we have with you today as well. Someone who has contributed so much to a lot of the content we enjoy here within the Rema Media universe, be it radio or TV. Of course, I'm talking about Karl Faase. He is a Christian communicator, CEO of Olive Tree Media, and he joins me right now. G'day there, Karl.
Hey, Andrew, it's great to be here. It's wonderful to be in Auckland and in New Zealand.
Isn't it great we can actually travel around and meet with one another now?
Oh, gosh, yeah. 2 years where you couldn't leave home. Although I got to say, sitting in the international exit lounge going to New Zealand, I feel like a fraud.
Oh, yeah? What's that?
Well, you're normally flying to London or,
I'm sorry, well, I'll talk with a different accent. Would that help?
No, just, you're normally going a long way and you're sitting there going, well, just going across there.
Yeah.
Surely my driver's license is enough.
Exactly.
Anyway.
Just look across and wave at the neighbours.
Good to be here.
So, tell us about yourself then, Karl. Tell us about Olive Tree Media. What's the background behind what you're doing?
Olive Tree Media, I actually started Olive Tree Media. My wife and I started Olive Tree Media when I was still working as a senior pastor of a local church. And I was, for want of a better word, Andrew, dabbling in media. I was doing some radio, I was doing some TV, just dabbling on the side. And then,
you got to be careful what you dabble with, mate. It becomes a full-time thing.
And then, we created Olive Tree Media. I won't go into the story in a quite unique way. And then it was just like once the vehicle was built, God decided to drive it in quite different places. So we moved into creating some large video TV content, which Shine TV shows, which is fantastic.
Yeah, well, that's the series, for example, like Faith Runs Deep, right?
Yep.
We've been playing that for a little while. Now, tell us about the genesis of that story.
Well, partly it was a bit of a COVID thing in the sense that we'd done Jesus the Game Changer and we'd filmed the second one, Jesus the Game Changer 2, in 14 countries.
Yep.
Well, we weren't leaving our lounge room, let alone leaving the country. But we realised, look, it's going to be a long time before we get overseas.
Sure.
And we'd always had in our heart to do something about Australia, to be focused more on Australia as a nation and this part of the world, as it were. So that we started to think that through and just thought, let's create a series that looks at the Christian influence in our nation.
Yeah. So tell us about then the places that you travelled to. Like, how did you select those and some of the stories that started to emerge?
I mean, it's really, we're trying to represent as much of Australia as we could.
Yeah.
In the end, we didn't get to the Northern Territory or Western Australia because they both remained closed.
Oh.
So they still were closed. So it was interesting. We had the first shutdown, and then we were like, great, we can now film. We start travelling. And then the second shutdown. And we thought, oh gosh, and we were locked down in Sydney for 12 weeks, that second one.
Sure.
And we thought, okay, it'll be ages. And we looked through what we had and actually discovered that we had 32 interviews already.
Wow.
And when we started to do some deeper analysis of what we'd actually filmed, we're actually fairly close. So we did a lot of editing work then. And the editing work, just to bore you, listeners, we were sitting at home. We created this huge whiteboard on the wall, and my wife, who's the creative director of Olive Tree Media and the producer of Faith Runs Deep, and I are sitting basically in the kitchen, writing up on this whiteboard what we've done, watching through, and then sending it through to our editor, and he's doing some work and sending stuff back. So we're actually just remotely from home doing this very initial cut. Then we realised how much we had and what we had in each episode, and then we went out again earlier this year, only this year. We were out in January, February, where we did the last of the filming. To get back to your original question, we did lots of parts of Australia, and in fact, the last we drove from Sydney to Melbourne across the Spirit of Tasmania on the boat to Tasmania, back across into South Australia to Barossa Valley, then all across the Nullarbor almost to Western Australia. So the Ute covered a lot of territory.
Yeah, no kidding. We'll talk about that Ute in a moment too, by the way.
Yeah.
I think too, sometimes we can forget about the scale of Australia as well. Something about, the way the maps are put together, it makes us look like these tiny little specks at the bottom of the country. I found out today, just out of nowhere, I'll put this down to the Lord inspiring me to look it up. Australia is wider in diameter than the moon.
Wow. I'll write that down and use it sometime.
So there you go. So what did you start to notice as well when you're traveling around these different parts? I mean, you really do get distinctive communities and stories and, of course, challenges as well. I guess you see how the church rises to the different challenges that are there as well. And what were some of the things you started to pick up about the spiritual states of Australia as well?
It's mixed and spread and it's different wherever you go. And what we were trying to do is not so much analyse what's happening right now, although that's, I've got some views on that and experience on that, but also where did Christian influence come into the nation and how did it come in different ways? And it's quite unique from even the earliest convicts. There was Christian influence there. And then a place like South Australia, which was 11,000 hectares was owned by a guy called George Fife Angus, who lived in England in the middle of the 19th century, who who's an evangelical Christian, and wanted to bring people of faith to South Australia.
Right.
So South Australia has a very deep Christian roots. The recognition that Tasmania was settled way before Melbourne and Victoria, and from Launceston people went to settle Victoria and Melbourne, and in each of those places there's Christian influence. So the other thing too, we so much of Australia is regional. As you say, it's just massive. And so we're just travelling, and getting as much red dust as we could, and that was just a wonderful experience. Yeah.
It always reminded me when I was a kid, the first time I visited Australia and I saw some of the road signs in terms of driving instructions, It's like, all right, this road sign here, it's only 13,000 kilometres or whatever. It's like, you've got to be kidding. Like, who would drive that? And Aussies are like, all right, fine.
Well, totally. It is vast. It is vast. And when you start driving, it's a few days before you get there. And we drove almost to the Western Australian border, which I said was closed.
Yeah, no kidding.
And even then, we were probably only halfway to Perth.
Yeah.
And that was a seriously long way.
And, you talked a little bit about some of the origin stories as well, about how faith came to different parts of Australia too. Does that connect a little bit to even the title of the series, this idea of faith running deep? Yeah.
I mean, the title Faith Runs Deep actually came from an article by a guy called Clive Hamilton, who's not a Christian, just writing, and he was writing an article in the ABC religion pages. ABC is the public broadcaster of Australia. And it was written in 2015. He was talking about being politically correct. Remember that? Before we talked about everybody being woke. We talked about them being politically correct.
Sure.
And he actually said, in this whole notion of being politically correct, we tend to push out some of our traditions.
Sure.
And he said, for example, I'm not a Christian, but Christian faith runs deep in this nation and shouldn't be discarded. Now, that's an interesting piece of insight that most people in Australia, most intellectuals and most commentators don't grasp. And so what we're trying to do is actually help people see the depth of that story, that narrative about who we are as a people. The narrative is that we were settled by the off-casts of England. We were kind of godless from the beginning, and we're still godless. That's just simply not true.
No, not at all. And I tell you what, though, something about Australia's, I guess, more recent history too has been grappling with some of the past where it comes to interactions with the Indigenous people as well, right?
Yeah.
And tell me about how that was a part of these stories.
Yeah, absolutely, because it's a painful story.
Yeah.
It's a painful story. Colonialisation is a terrible thing.
Yeah.
And then you had the stolen generation, which is an awful thing. There's deaths in custody. And in a way, we deal with all of that just a little bit. One episode is on the Indigenous people and the influence of Christian faith into their lives, into that community. But also, probably the one group of people that's overrepresented in the series from a percentage perspective are Indigenous Australians. They're all through the series, and they tell their story. And intriguingly, which is odd really, a greater percentage of Indigenous Australians will tick a Christianity box than your average Australian.
Well, it's actually similar to New Zealand. And again, I find it an incredible paradox. And in some ways, I speak maybe to the universality of the message, because I mean, the Māori people in New Zealand as well suffered greatly from colonialism too. And yet at the same time, the way in which they have made Christianity their own within their culture too is amazing. In some ways, you get to rediscover the faith again and seeing how it speaks to this group that otherwise, culturally, you might be very different from.
And look, one of our guests, Sandra Dumas, actually says, faith was here long before we were. Now, a lot of Christians get a bit nervous about that, but what she's saying, that they're a deeply religious people, and I think the Maori would be the same.
Yeah, I agree.
And it was a bit like, she said, but we needed Jesus, and they absolutely do, and they recognise that they do. And so Jesus it's not syncretism, but Jesus speaks into their life and into their spirituality, and there's a deep richness in that. And so we just had fabulous, wonderful stories in the series about their faith.
I love it. And so, when we're talking about these cultural issues as well, there is a unique cultural symbol that I think New Zealanders and Aussies relate to very strongly, that of the ute. The ute is a symbol of what it means to be a Kiwi or an Aussie, and it's quite a key part of your journey as well, right? Tell us about that.
Oh, well, we kind of ripped off an idea out of an American series called Driving Through History, where Dave Stocks is brilliant, absolutely brilliant presenter. And he takes a car that represents that nation and drives it around as he tells the history. And we're like, that's a good idea. So we thought, we need to get an iconic Australian car to drive around. And what's more iconic than a black V8 6-litre It's a tough job, but someone has to do it.
No
Hold a
kidding.
ute, and it's
Yeah.
a thing of wonder and beauty.
No
Andrew.
kidding.
So we drove this thing 18,000 kilometres. You know, the ute's got a funny kind of connection with
go on
the
then.
church.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the kind of early 20th century, around 1930s, a Gippsland farmer's wife actually wrote to the Ford Motor Company and said, I need a car that I can drive to church on a Sunday and not get wet, and my husband can drive the pigs to market on a Monday. So Adam Bant, who was, Lou Bant, Adam Bant's a politician, Lou Bant, who worked for the Ford Motor Company, cut the back off a sedan, reinforced the chassis, put on a back tray, first Holden ute.
Mate.
So you can get to church on a Sunday and not get wet, and pigs on market on Monday. So the ute has this kind of Christian connection.
You don't want to get mixed up and take your wife to the pig market and then bring the pigs to church on Sunday, but
no, you got to get that right.
that's a lesson. That's a mistake you only make once.
No.
What were some of the other more unusual stories as well that emerged from your journey around Australia?
Oh, look, we just had fabulous stories. You know, like a mate of mine when I was making the stories rang me that we were doing these, and he lives in regional Australia, and he said, if you need any regional stories, let me know. Yep. I'm like, Duncan, do you know a bull rider? And he's like, because I'm thinking, when I'm thinking about this series, we need a bull rider. You know? So he said, yeah, Tim Kelly. So we drove up to Kingaroy and interviewed Tim Kelly, and he had one of his mates ride one of his bulls because he rides so we had Tim Kelly, and then we had Tony Huang, who was a drug dealer on the streets of Cabramatta, jailed at 14, came back out, got better at selling drugs, became one of the leaders of, it wasn't just he was selling it personally, he had people working for him, and then radically came to faith in Cabramatta, sitting on the streets of Cabramatta. Wow. And then, you know what he does now? He runs a church in Cabramatta. Of course he does. So he's a Vietnamese background, that's just a fabulous story. And then Bindi Kol Choka, who came from Melbourne, grew up in St Kilda. If you don't, people would know that St Kilda is the red light district of Melbourne, especially as she was growing up, 70s, 80s, much more in that zone. And her mother was a stripper, a prostitute, and a drug addict. And that was a single mum. And that was her growing up years. Runs away to London, ends up selling drugs in London herself, and had this remarkable experience of God in a jail cell. Wow. So, these are the really unique stories. And then Peter Gibbs was a Indigenous young man who played for the Australian rugby league team, junior rugby league team at 14. Okay. And then ended up playing for the Roosters, the Sydney Roosters, as in the reserve grade. Broke his arm, went back to Dubbo. Kind of an awful story in lots of ways. Felt suicidal. God impacted his life, but also his sister died in custody, so a death in custody. And out of that, he started a thing called iProud, which is recruiting Indigenous young people into the police force. Wow. So it's this story with so many different facets. And so we tell that story as well. And Riverbank Frank, whose name is Riverbank because he lives in a caravan on the riverbank at Dubbo.
Not just a clever name then.
No, he just thought, when he grew up, there's kind of Christian connections with his Indigenous family. Right. But he felt, I felt like I was sold a dud because these people really didn't care about my people. Wow. Wanted to be a revolutionary, went to Sydney, lived in Redfern, ended up in Western Sydney. And then he says, he met a priest and he watched the priest and he thought, that guy actually represents the Jesus that I think he should. And now he's come back to faith and attends church every week, and he's just a remarkable guy. So spread of stories, Andrew.
That's amazing. And of course, that gives you the kind of up-close personal stories as well. But what kind of perspective has this given you then on the wider place and future of the church within Australia as well? Where is it tracking, changing, growing? What are the opportunities?
The opportunities are enormous. I'm not sure the kind of numbers of immigration in New Zealand, but Australia, 1 in 3 people are born overseas. Now, a lot of people think that means, and that's kind of shifted from southern, like England, then Southern Europe, then Asia. Now it's the subcontinent. You know, like so many people coming from India, Pakistan, the subcontinent.
But 1 in 3, though, I mean, that's
it's
a
lot.
phenomenal number,
But
sure.
a lot of people sort of see that, oh, that's a big issue, like that's a problem, that's decreasing the Christian influence in the nation. And yet they, as a group of people, are more open to faith. And some of the fastest growing churches within Australia are actually churches in different ethnic groups. So that's a great opportunity. But one of the things that this series is trying to do is to redress the narrative, to change the narrative. The narrative is that the church has never, no one's ever been interested. Everybody's dismissed the church, and it was a failure then, it's a failure now. And that's simply not true. None of that's true. So we need to tell a different story.
Yeah, well, I mean, even as we're sitting here right now as well, there are certain events going on in New Zealand as well, where people are packing out stadiums and things, and it's very easy to get that sense of people don't want to hear, people don't want to know, you know, and yet, so, I mean, now we're talking about New Zealand as well as Australia, but what about that wider sense then of the, I guess, the Western church as well? Because I feel like that narrative is one we hear about fairly broadly, right? That maybe in the Western world, Christianity is on the decline, or it's not as, there's not as much interest now. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, because I mean that's, if you compared it to say the 1950s in Australia, that was the sort of heyday. It wasn't Christendom, but that was the, sort of the heyday.
Yeah, sure.
And compared to that, the numbers are much lower who are turning up the church every week. There's two perspectives to keep for us all to keep in mind. The church across the globe, the Christian church across the globe, is exploding. Africa, South America, China. So there's not a problem with faith. In the Western world, it is a problem, and it's something we need to redress, and we need to recapture again a heart for evangelism and a heart for mission. And one of the problems, a researcher in Australia just recently, Ruth Powell, works for the NCLS, said one of the issues is who holds the microphone. And at the moment, who holds the microphone in a place like New Zealand or a place like Australia are often a commentariat who are negatively disposed to faith, church, religion. And so what you often hear in some media circles, some areas of social media, is that everybody hates the church, Christians are on the nose, nobody's interested. But if you go to average people, and we've done a whole bunch of research, which I won't bore you with, which basically says the people aren't all negative. A high percentage of people still call themselves Christian, even though we think they're probably not a Christian. And in Australia just recently, there was 1 in 3 people, if asked by a friend, would attend church.
Wow. Actually, we heard a stat very recently within New Zealand as well, speaking particularly about the media community, where again we often get the sense that they're not positively disposed to. And I think something that came out of that impacted me was that I suppose if you ask, do people want to be told how to live their lives by Christians, then I'm sure even most Christians would put that in single figures. But when offered, hey, can I pray for you? Literally 0 in terms of the number of people who said, no, I don't want that at all. That 100 of the people who are asked this thing, no, negative aggressive response is more like, oh wow, nobody likes to be told what to think and what to do and how to live. But everybody is actually quite open to faith, quite open to spiritual life, quite open to some of those bigger questions about what's important in life. And we've got to start speaking into that. The other thing, there's an article in the Sydney Morning Herald today, just today, there's an article in the Sydney Morning Herald which basically is talking about the epidemic of loneliness in a place like Sydney. And that people in their 20s, there's a group that works in Sydney that was basically working with shut-ins and older people, and now helping people in their 20s because they're desperately lonely. Now, in an epidemic of loneliness, when 1 in 3 people will come to church, in a time where people are asking some big questions about what matters, invite your friends to be a part of it. And the community is just help envelop people. They may not all come to faith, but there's lots and lots of opportunity there. So I think for the church in the West, there's all sorts of, difficulties that we're having, both with people not turning up and some very unhelpful decisions that some church leaders have made, and that's been incredibly unhelpful for us for the church across the globe. And yet there's still plenty of opportunity, and we need to kind of be on the front foot with that opportunity. And my thing, Andrew, would be, let's stop being apologetic about what we believe. Like there's a whole bunch of places where you think, there's like, we're sorry for this, we're sorry for that. Like seriously, be on the front foot. Be positive, be warm, be open, be strong
positive about your faith, and I think you'll get a good hearing.
Well, it sounds like we're not short of inspiration for what's to come next from Olive Tree Media.
Yeah.
Then what is next for you?
That's a great question. We had an idea, which I won't tell you because we probably won't do it. So we're thinking about a few different directions, and I mean, one of the things that's really on our heart is the research is showing. I mean, I just think this is crazy. Research is showing recently that 50% of people are not sure that Jesus was an actual historical person.
No kidding.
Like you just think, I thought we dealt with that. So
yeah.
you suddenly think, gosh, you know, you have to keep revisiting these questions, which is Jesus a real person? Who was he? Why would we believe him? Now that's kind of getting to the apologetics area, and we don't want to bury ourselves in intellectual apologetics, but we do want to give a response to people who are asking some of those big questions. So I think that's a bit in the mix. And we'll see what happens. But right now, we're talking to schools in Australia and camping ministries and local churches and regional events. So Faith Runs Deep has got a long way to run just yet.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, I mean, I love this storytelling medium as well. I think, you know, and when we talk about how to share your faith, people can argue over doctrine and those sorts of things, but to have a story that people share, right, that carries the message so well.
Yes, I mean, stories are really important. And one of the things that, without going on too long, one of the things that we really focused on in this series is that, and if you watch the trailer, is that stories matter. Yeah. And it's one of those things of what do we do when we get together, Andrew? When you get together with your family, you tend not to have long esoteric discussions about you know, about the world and politics, although our family do a lot. But you tend to tell stories, and you'll get to, like Christmas is not far away, and we'll tell stories about. And what do? We tell stories about what happened this year, and families get together and they tell the same stories. Yeah, like, and nobody says we've heard that 5 times. Yeah. I think because stories and stories. Stories are really important because they don't just entertain, they carry values. They do. And so when we tell stories, we pass on values. And the stories we choose to tell says something about the values we think are important. And so I think that's why if you're telling your own story, faith needs to be a part of it. But when you're telling a nation's story, faith needs to be we think faith needs to be a deep and important and integral part of the story of our nations, both Australia and New Zealand, great stories of faith. So we need to tell those stories because stories matter and stories will actually shift our culture. Well, we're really grateful for you telling those stories as well, and thank you so much for what you've contributed to our viewers and listeners as well. So again, Faith Runs Deep is on Shine On Demand right now, so you can check it out if you go to shinetv.co.nz. Thanks everybody for watching.